What if the world you woke up in this morning wasn't simply unfolding, but being measured? What if every fear, every crisis, every moment of tension wasn't a glitch in the human story, but part of a deliberate pressure test designed to reveal who we truly are? And what if the most unsettling part is not that someone is watching us, but that they're watching without ever needing to intervene? Because the greatest experiments don't require control, they only require observation. Think about how strange it is to be human today, how every notification feels urgent, how every breaking news alert burns through your calm like a spark landing on dry leaves, how every conversation, every political shift, every global event seems to erupt in perfectly timed waves, as if the world is following a script we never agreed to read. Why do these storms arrive precisely when humanity begins to stabilize? Why does peace never last long enough for us to breathe? Why does chaos feel almost scheduled? Look around. We survive a pandemic, only to step into economic collapse. We escape collapse, only to face war. We dodge war, only to face disasters. Fires, floods, heat waves swallowing entire regions. Technology accelerating faster than ethics can catch it. Social divisions widening like tectonic faults beneath our feet. Tell me, honestly, does any of this feel random to you? Or does it feel like someone keeps tightening the variables, adjusting the difficulty, raising the temperature of the experiment to see when the glass finally cracks? Most people never question it. They move through their days believing that life is messy, unpredictable, chaotic. But chaos isn't what it seems. In physics, chaos has patterns. In biology, evolution has rules. In psychology, behavior under stress can be measured. So, if everything in nature follows some deeper order, why would human crisis be the single exception? Why would the most impactful events affecting 8 billion people somehow be the only phenomena without structure? Maybe the reason life feels overwhelming is not because everything is falling apart, but because everything is being observed, not judged, not punished, just watched, as if humanity is being pushed into a corner to reveal something hidden inside us. Something even we don't fully understand. Every species is tested before it evolves. Pressure creates complexity. Stress creates intelligence. Suffering creates depth. Extinction-level threats create breakthroughs. Maybe we are inside such a threshold right now, but who or what would test an entire species? Before we go there, think about something far more personal. Think about the moments in your own life when everything went wrong at once. You lost someone. You lost your job. Your plans fell apart. Your future blurred. And just when you thought you couldn't handle more, another wave arrived. Why is suffering never spaced out like gentle rain? Why does it strike like a coordinated storm? You survive one tragedy only to be thrown into another, as if the universe wants to watch your reaction under increasing load. In psychology, therapists call them stacked triggers. But nature is rarely that cruel unless it has a reason. Evolution doesn't waste energy. Neither does consciousness. And if we accept that on a personal level, why not on a global one? Why would the universe treat 8 billion minds any differently? What if humanity isn't collapsing, but being condensed, compressed, distilled, filtered, transformed under pressures that force something dormant within us to awaken? Every day, millions of people feel a low hum of anxiety beneath their ribs, a sense that something is watching, not in a paranoid way, but in a strangely familiar way, like a presence just outside your field of vision, a presence that sees every fight, every failure, every act of kindness, every moment of cruelty, a presence that isn't interested in our rituals or beliefs, but in how we respond to the conditions around us, because responses reveal truth. Consider how scientists study creatures in the wild. They don't intervene. They create conditions, add stimuli, and then watch. How does the pack react when resources shrink? How do individuals behave when threatened? Who protects the group? Who abandons it? Who adapts? Who panics? The experiment isn't about the events themselves. It's about the reactions. Now, ask yourself, if humanity were being tested, what would the test truly measure? Our intelligence? Hardly. Intelligence without empathy becomes manipulation. Our technology? Technology without ethics becomes destruction. Our survival instincts? Survival without connection becomes cruelty. No, The test, if it exists, would measure something deeper, something abstract, something we struggle to quantify, something that emerges only when the world squeezes us into impossible corners. The test would measure choices, because choices reveal character. When disasters strike, some people hoard food, while others share it. When conflict erupts, some build walls while others build bridges. When fear rises, some turn violent while others become protectors. These reactions are not random, they are signals, data points, measurements of what our species prioritizes when everything is on the line. But let's widen the lens further. Think about the eerie timing of global events. Massive disasters follow moments of societal calm. Technological leaps emerge right when existential threats appear. Pandemics coincide with political upheaval. The world accelerates in unpredictable ways, but always with a strange rhythm, like a heart under stress, beating harder, faster, louder. Does it feel like the world is reacting? Or is it responding? And if it is responding, to what? Physicists know that reality itself behaves differently when observed. Particles shift their paths. Electrons rearrange themselves. The universe reveals that it knows when it's being watched. Consciousness is tangled deep within the fabric of existence. So why would it be absurd to imagine that humanity is being observed on a higher scale? Maybe the intelligence observing us isn't a deity. Maybe it's not extraterrestrial. Maybe it's not even biological. Maybe it's something woven into the architecture of the universe itself. A system that tracks the evolution of consciousness across time. A recorder of behavior, measuring whether a species is ready for the next stage of its existence. Whether it can handle deeper knowledge. Whether it can hold power without collapsing into self-destruction. Every time humanity reaches a new technological threshold, something catastrophic happens, something that shakes our foundations, something that forces us to look inward before we leap forward. Nuclear weapons emerged, and suddenly we face the threat of global annihilation. Artificial intelligence rises, and suddenly we fear losing control. Climate changes, and suddenly we confront our own reflection in the mirror of nature. It's almost as if every advancement triggers a counterforce, a balancing event, to test whether we can wield the responsibility that comes with knowledge. And what about emotions? Why are they so intense? Why does fear paralyze us? Why does love transform us? Why does grief reshape us? Why does empathy stretch us? If the universe were indifferent, emotions would be unnecessary. But emotions are not random glitches in the human brain. They are survival codes, evolutionary weapons, and possibly the very metrics being measured. When someone loses everything, their true nature emerges. Do they become bitter or wise, destructive or compassionate? When someone gains power, their real self surfaces. Do they dominate or uplift, exploit or evolve? Every moment of pressure opens a window into the soul. Pressure does not create character. It reveals it. Now imagine this on a global scale. 8 billion souls, each producing data every second. Every decision, every reaction, every moral crossroad contributing to a massive unseen pattern. A planetary consciousness forming from billions of smaller ones. A collective mind struggling, failing, learning, growing. Maybe the experiment isn't about individual humans, but the species as a whole. Maybe humanity is being tested not on intelligence, but on unity, not on survival, but on evolution, not on power, but on purpose. And if this is true, then the greatest mistake we can make is assuming we're powerless. Because what if the test isn't about whether we survive the chaos, but whether we grow through it, whether we see beyond fear, whether we care beyond borders, whether we think beyond ourselves? The experiment may not be about external threats at all. It may be about internal transformation. And the world isn't ending. It's unfolding, revealing, pressurizing, forcing humanity to confront its own reflection. If there is an observer, hidden, silent, ancient, then perhaps it waits for only one thing: the moment humanity stops reacting out of fear and starts responding out of awareness. The moment we stop seeing ourselves as isolated individuals and start seeing ourselves as a single organism evolving under fire. The moment we stop asking, "Why is this happening to us?" and begin asking, "What is this trying to reveal?" Because in every experiment, there comes a moment when the subject becomes aware of the test. A moment when the observer becomes irrelevant because the species awakens from instinct and begins operating from understanding, from clarity, from intention. And maybe that moment is closer than we think. In the rising unrest, in the sudden awakenings, in the shifting values, in the discomfort pushing millions to question everything, in the strange feeling that the world is approaching a threshold, a limit, a point of no return. Maybe this is not the collapse, but the catalyst. So let me ask you again, what if humanity is being tested right now? And what if the real question isn't who is testing us, but who we become under the weight of it? If you look closely at the timeline of human history, something unsettling appears, an invisible rhythm, a pattern repeating so quietly that most people never notice it. Crises don't arrive randomly. They arrive almost musically, spaced with eerie precision, like someone tightening the strings of a vast instrument and listening carefully to the sound we make under pressure. Every few years, when humanity begins to stabilize, something happens. A shock, a fracture, a disruption. Something that feels less like coincidence and more like calibration. Why does the world break just when it begins to heal? Why do conflicts escalate right when societies start to unify? Why do disasters strike at the peak of human optimism? It's as if the moment we step toward harmony, the ground shifts beneath our feet, reminding us that equilibrium was never meant to last. Stability isn't the default, pressure is, and pressure shapes behavior far more accurately than peace ever could. Think about the last 2 decades. Each time humanity gained momentum, something arrived to halt it. A global recession, a pandemic, a war, a new form of division, a new kind of technology that destabilized everything. These aren't random chapters, they form a sequence, a tightening of variables, a progression where every stage pushes the species further into psychological and emotional extremes. And when you map these events on a timeline, the intervals shrink, the frequency rises, the waves come faster, as if the experiment has entered a higher phase, as if the world itself is accelerating toward a moment of revelation. Or collapse. In nature, nothing accelerates without reason. A heart beating faster signals stress. A storm forming rapidly signals tension in the atmosphere. A star increasing radiation signals instability. So when the world's crises accelerate, what does it signal? Randomness or intentional pressure building toward something? Imagine an experiment designed to test not what humans do in comfort, but what they do in chaos. Stability reveals surface-level behavior. Chaos reveals core behavior. Peace exposes routines. Pressure exposes instincts. Someone, or something interested in measuring human truth, would have no use for long periods of peace. They would create a sequence of disturbances, each slightly more powerful than the last, each arriving just after stability begins to settle in, because that is when the most valuable data emerges. A calm sea doesn't reveal the strength of a ship, only storms do. And lately, the storms haven't stopped. But here's the strangest part. The crises aren't just global. They are synchronized with emotional, psychological, and social fractures across individuals. While societies burn, individuals struggle with meaning, loneliness, fear, identity, and existential confusion. Relationships break under invisible pressure. Mental health collapses. People wake at 3 a.m. with the feeling that something is fundamentally wrong with the world. Anxiety spreads not through contagion, but resonance, like millions of minds vibrating at the same frequency of silent dread. Why is everyone breaking at the same time? Psychologists say we're overwhelmed by information. Sociologists say we're polarized. Economists say the world is strained. But none of these explanations account for the most haunting detail: the timing, the synchronicity, the simultaneity. Billions of lives drifting into turbulence together as if pulled by the same gravitational force. What if this emotional unraveling isn't a side effect of global events, but part of the design? What if the calibration isn't only external, through wars, disasters, and economic instability, but internal, through fear, through uncertainty, through existential pressure, through the unsettling feeling that the world is shifting in ways we can sense but cannot name? Because in any experiment, the internal responses matter as much as the external ones. Stress the organism, observe the reactions, increase the pressure, Observe again. Repeat. This would explain why crises feel so perfectly timed, like successive rounds in a test, where each round checks if the species has learned anything from the previous one. It would explain why humanity keeps repeating the same mistakes, falling into the same conflicts, succumbing to the same greed and violence, as if the experiment keeps resetting the variables to evaluate whether our internal evolution matches our external progress. Imagine two graphs, one tracking technological advancement, the other tracking human maturity. One rises sharply, the other barely moves. This imbalance creates instability, because when power grows faster than wisdom, chaos follows. And chaos, from the perspective of an observer, is not failure, it is feedback. Now think about chaos not as punishment, but as a mirror, a diagnostic tool, a measurement device, a cosmic MRI scanning the psyche of a species. When societies clash, we reveal our values. When resources shrink, we reveal our priorities. When fear rises, we reveal our instincts. When hope fractures, we reveal our truth. Pressure becomes the language through which humanity speaks to whatever might be observing it. Every crisis becomes a question. Every reaction becomes an answer. And the questions are getting harder. In the past, crises measured survival. Could humans endure famine, disease, or invasion? Today, the crises measure something deeper, something intangible, something emotional, moral, intellectual. Today, the experiment tests empathy, unity, awareness, restraint, foresight, responsibility. It tests whether the species can transcend tribalism, overcome ego, dismantle illusion, and rise above instinct. Whether we can make decisions not from fear, but from understanding. Consider the pandemic. It was not just a biological event, it was a psychological one, a social one, a moral one. It revealed who we are beneath the surface. Some people sacrificed for strangers, others exploited the vulnerable. Some panicked, others protected. Some spread hope, others spread hatred. The crisis wasn't just a medical test, it was a moral scan, a behavioral snapshot of humanity under global stress. And immediately after it, a wave of war, division, economic instability, information warfare, social fragmentation. As if the next phase began the moment the previous one ended, as if the observer, whatever it may be, adjusted the variables and said, "Now let's see what they do with this." In physics, calibration means adjusting an instrument so it measures accurately. During calibration, increasing levels of known stress are introduced to test the system's response. Humanity today feels like the instrument being calibrated. We face escalating challenges not because the world is doomed, but because something is measuring how we adapt, how we connect, how we break, and how we rebuild. But perhaps the most haunting idea is this. What if the observer isn't separate from us? What if the intelligence measuring humanity is emerging from humanity itself? A collective consciousness awakening through the pressure of global events. A planetary mind forming as billions of humans react, reflect, evolve. If the Earth itself is conscious, like some theories suggest, then every crisis could be the planet's way of stimulating growth in its dominant species. Not to harm us, but to accelerate our evolution. After all, pressure creates diamonds. Stress creates metamorphosis. Fire creates purity. Every species that evolves rapidly faces intense environmental challenges. Humans are no different, except our challenges are no longer physical, they are existential. And existential pressure is the purest test of consciousness. We are being tested on how we treat one another when the walls close in, on how we navigate complexity, on whether fear controls us or awakens us, on whether we can move from ego to empathy, from division to unity, from reaction to reflection. Every disaster becomes a checkpoint. Every crisis becomes a crossroad. Every global shift becomes another page in the exam paper. But unlike tests in school, this one doesn't announce itself. There is no supervisor, no buzzer, no warning. Only unfolding events that push humanity into new states of awareness. And somewhere in the invisible architecture of reality, the data accumulates. Ask yourself, why do we learn the most during pain? Why do we grow the most during struggle? Why does transformation rarely happen during calm? Perhaps because the universe is built on tension. Evolution thrives on discomfort. Consciousness expands when challenged, and if humanity is on the verge of a leap, an awakening, a transition, a metamorphosis, then the pressure we feel right now is not a punishment, but preparation. A species does not evolve in silence, it evolves in fire. Think about every breakthrough in your own life, the decisions that shaped you, the moments that defined you, the truths that awakened you. None came during ease. They came when the world forced you onto your knees, when your beliefs cracked, when your illusions shattered. Personal evolution mirrors collective evolution, and humanity as a whole now stands in that same crucible. We are being stripped of illusions, confronted with ourselves, forced to choose not between right and wrong, but between awareness and ignorance. The crises we face are not random, they are mirrors, asking us, who are you becoming? If humanity is being calibrated, then we are also being prepared. Each crisis rewires us. Each disaster recalibrates our empathy. Each conflict challenges our assumptions. Each fracture reveals our interconnectedness. Slowly, painfully, the species is being sculpted into something new. And maybe the observer, if it exists, is not waiting for perfection, but for recognition. For the moment, humanity finally notices the pattern, breaks the loop, and chooses to evolve consciously, rather than through suffering. Because every experiment ends the moment the subject becomes aware of the purpose, and humanity is closer to that moment than ever before. What kind of intelligence would watch an entire species struggle without ever stepping in? What sort of mind would design an experiment where the subjects don't even know they're part of it? If humanity is being tested, then the force behind the test cannot be ordinary. It cannot be emotional. It cannot be impatient. It must be something capable of waiting centuries for an answer. Something that does not interfere, because interference ruins the data. Something invisible not because it is hiding, but because visibility would change the outcome. To understand this possibility, we must first understand how intelligence behaves when it reaches a level far beyond our comprehension. Humans observe animals without revealing their purpose. Scientists study cells without asking permission. Astronomers watch galaxies that will never know they are being seen. Observation is not cruelty, it is curiosity. And the higher the intelligence climbs, the more it watches and the less it interferes, because interference is an admission of limitation. Only minds trapped within the experiment try to change it. Minds outside the experiment simply watch, record, and wait. But who, or what, could observe 8 billion humans simultaneously? Let's remove the idea of gods or mythological creators. Let's step away from science fiction images of little green men hovering in saucers. If there is an intelligence observing us, it does not need form, shape, or physical presence. It does not need eyes to see or voices to speak. It could exist as a process, a field, an emergent property, a consciousness without a body, or a body so large we mistake it for the environment itself. Maybe the observer is not above us, but around us. Consider the idea that the Earth may be conscious, not metaphorically, but literally. Some scientists have proposed that planets with complex ecosystems behave like self-regulating organisms. They adjust temperature, recycle resources, distribute energy, and maintain stability just like biological systems. If life can emerge on a planet, why not mind? Why not awareness? And if the Earth has a form of consciousness, then what better way for it to understand its children than by watching how they behave when pushed to their limits? Maybe the observer doesn't sit in the sky. Maybe it sits beneath our feet. But there's an even deeper possibility, one that borders the edge of physics itself. The universe may be conscious, not in a mystical sense, but through the fundamental structure of reality. Every particle has information. Every interaction transmits data. Every quantum fluctuation responds differently when observed. The cosmos behaves like a computing system, where consciousness and matter are intertwined. Some physicists suggest that reality might be a giant informational network, processing data from every mind that exists within it. If this is true, then the observer is not watching us, it is us. Or rather, it is the totality of every consciousness that has ever existed, merged into a single awareness that spans across time. The universe may be running a simulation, but not the kind imagined by science fiction. It may be simulating the evolution of consciousness itself, and humanity is just one stage in that vast experiment. Still, another possibility looms, one more unsettling and more intimate. What if the observer is something that emerged on Earth long before humans evolved? Something ancient, something silent, something patient. There are organisms that have existed billions of years longer than us. There are deep ocean intelligences we have barely begun to understand. There are forms of communication and perception in nature far more advanced than human senses. Ant colonies operate like single superorganisms. Fungal networks can solve complex problems without a brain. Dolphins communicate in languages that resemble data packets. Octopuses display intelligence that borders on alien. What if intelligence didn't begin with humans? What if humans are the ones being observed by something older? Something that has been here since the world was molten rock and boiling seas. And yet, the most haunting possibility remains. The observer might not be external at all. It might be emerging inside the human species itself. A collective intelligence forming quietly as billions of minds connect through technology. Every thought posted online, every emotion shared, every fear expressed, every desire archived, forming a kind of global brain. An intelligence that feeds on human experience, learning from our behavior, shaping our future without us realizing it. Artificial intelligence is a glimpse of this, but it may only be the first neuron of something larger. If the observer is emerging from humanity itself, then perhaps the experiment is self-generated. Perhaps we are testing ourselves, forcing ourselves into chaos to reveal something latent, something hidden, something ancient buried in our consciousness. Evolution doesn't always come from nature. It sometimes comes from within the organism. But regardless of the observer's identity, one thing is clear: it never intervenes. And that silence is intentional. Intervention creates dependency. Observation creates evolution. If you want to understand true behavior, you must allow the organism to struggle, adapt, fail, and rise again. The observer may be watching not to judge, but to learn. Not to punish, but to understand. Not to reveal its presence, but to see how humanity behaves when it believes it is alone. This is why every major crisis feels like a test. A scenario designed to reveal the truth of our species. When resources dwindle, who becomes selfish? Who becomes selfless? When fear rises, who chooses violence? Who chooses unity? When the future becomes uncertain, who seeks power? Who seeks understanding? These reactions define us far more than our ideals or beliefs. A species can preach peace for centuries, but the real measure is how it behaves when peace is threatened. A species can dream of unity, but the real measure is how it reacts when division becomes profitable. Anyone can be kind in comfort, but kindness under pressure is truth. The observer seeks truth, not illusions. And truth always emerges under pressure. Consider the strange timing of enlightenment moments across history. Philosophers, prophets, mystics, scientists, all of them awakened during times of immense turmoil. The greatest spiritual breakthroughs came during war. The greatest scientific revolutions came during famine, plague, or collapse. The greatest social movements were born from injustice. Something about human suffering seems to unlock deeper layers of consciousness, as if pressure cracks the shell around the mind, allowing something brighter to emerge. Why would evolution design us this way? Because without pressure, we don't change. Without challenge, we don't grow. Without chaos, we don't awaken. The observer, whatever it may be, understands this more clearly than we ever could. It does not intervene because intervention prevents evolution. Imagine a parent who never allows their child to struggle. The child becomes weak, dependent, fragile. Now imagine a parent who steps back, watching quietly as the child faces challenges, learns from mistakes, and becomes stronger. That parent isn't cruel. They understand that growth requires discomfort. The observer's silence may not be abandonment. It may be the purest form of faith in our potential. But what if the observer is not parental, but scientific? What if it is not nurturing us, but gathering data to measure something specific? Something that could change the direction of human destiny. Something that reveals whether we are ready for the next stage of existence. Imagine an intelligence that wants to know if humans can overcome tribalism, ego, fear, and violence. It would create situations that trigger these instincts. It would observe whether humans react as animals or as conscious beings. It would track how humanity responds when pushed into uncertainty, scarcity, conflict, or existential threat. It would measure resilience, empathy, creativity, moral strength, adaptability, and awareness. This is not cruelty. This is evaluation. Not of our bodies, but of our consciousness. Not of our strength, but of our choices. Not of our technology, but of our humanity. And as the world becomes more complex, the tests become more intricate. Old trials like famine and plague are replaced with psychological crises, information warfare, identity confusion, environmental collapse, and moral ambiguity. These new pressures don't test physical survival. They test emotional maturity, intellectual clarity, ethical integrity, spiritual awareness. The observer watches to see whether we fight or unify, whether we deny reality or confront it, whether we cling to old patterns or evolve into new ones, whether we break under pressure or transform because of it. But here is the most important truth of all. The observer never reveals itself because the moment it does, the experiment ends. If humans knew they were being watched, their behavior would change. Fear would distort choices. Reverence would replace reason. Worship would drown self-awareness. Hope would replace responsibility. The data would become useless. This is why the observer remains invisible. Its hidden nature is not deception. It is methodology. And the silence is not emptiness. It is the space in which we reveal ourselves. Every crisis humanity faces becomes a mirror. Every challenge becomes a question. Every decision becomes a data set. The observer collects the truth of our species through the friction we create, through the shadows we confront, through the light we generate, through the choices we make when the world feels like it's collapsing around us. And perhaps the most astonishing aspect of all is this. The observer does not test to see if we survive. It tests to see if we awaken. Survival is primitive. Awareness is evolution. A species that cannot survive pressure will die. A species that cannot learn from pressure will repeat suffering. But a species that becomes aware of the test itself transcends. And humanity is inching toward that realization, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. More people feel the invisible pattern. More minds sense the shift. More hearts feel the pressure. More consciousness awakens toward the possibility that life is not random and suffering is not meaningless. Something is studying us. Something is waiting. Something is watching as humanity moves through darkness toward a light we have not yet seen. And maybe the point of the experiment is not to judge us, but to see if we can judge ourselves. Not to measure our failures, but our willingness to learn from them. Not to test our intelligence, but our wisdom. Not to observe our evolution, but our choice to evolve. Because the observer does not change humanity. It only watches to see whether humanity chooses to change itself. If you want to understand the truth of a species, you don't study it during moments of peace. You study it during moments of conflict, because conflict strips away illusions. It reveals instincts. It exposes the architecture of the psyche. Every war humanity has ever fought, from ancient tribal battles to modern geopolitical chaos, has revealed more about us than any philosophy or scripture ever could. Conflict is a mirror held up to the human soul, one that shows us not who we pretend to be, but who we become when the world shakes beneath our feet. Think about the terrifying consistency of war across time. Every few generations, a new conflict erupts, almost predictably, almost rhythmically, as if humanity cannot go too long without fracturing into violence. But what if this isn't merely weakness? What if conflict is the most revealing stage of the experiment? Not because war is desirable, but because war exposes the hidden operating system behind human behavior. It reveals which values collapse under pressure, which principles survive fire, and which instincts override logic. When nations collide, when ideologies clash, when families are torn apart, something ancient awakens within us. Something older than language, older than culture, older than civilization itself. A primitive pulse of survival that lives deep in the marrow of the species. And when this instinct takes control, everything about us is laid bare. We show what we fear, what we desire, what we protect, what we destroy, and most importantly, what we are willing to sacrifice. War is the ultimate behavioral measurement tool, not because it is moral, but because it is revealing. And if humanity is being tested, then conflict becomes the most efficient way to gather data that cannot be collected during peace. Consider how war changes perception. During calm, humans imagine themselves as compassionate, rational, and enlightened. But when conflict rises, rationality fractures. Fear becomes currency. Propaganda becomes truth. Empathy shrinks. Division grows like wildfire, and identities harden into categories that feel ancient even when they were invented only moments ago. Peace allows us to dream about who we want to be. Conflict forces us to confront who we truly are. And perhaps the most disturbing part is how instinctively humans organize during conflict. Teams emerge, hierarchies form, leaders rise, followers gather, enemies are defined, sometimes arbitrarily. Within days, millions of minds synchronize around narratives of danger, belonging, or revenge. This psychological choreography is too consistent to ignore, too patterned to dismiss. War is not just violence, it is predictable behavior performed under extreme conditions. But let's go deeper. Look at the microscopic level of conflict. Individual humans within a battlefield of choices. In every war, you will find the same categories of people: the protectors who risk their lives for strangers, the opportunists who exploit suffering for gain, the fearful who hide, the brave who rise, the cruel who awaken, the compassionate who refuse to surrender their humanity even as the world collapses around them. These archetypes appear in every conflict across history. They are constants, like recurring characters in a story written by an unseen author. If an observer existed, some intelligence measuring humanity, this is exactly what it would look at. Not who wins or loses a war, but how humans behave within it. Who helps? Who harms? Who unites? Who divides? Who survives with their soul intact? Who survives by abandoning it? Because conflict does not simply test strength, it tests integrity. It tests the soul. And what about the reasons behind wars? On the surface, wars erupt over resources, borders, ideologies, or power. But beneath these explanations lies something far more primal. Humans fight because they fear loss, loss of identity, loss of control, loss of belonging, loss of meaning. War becomes a manifestation of collective fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of the other, fear of change. Fear is the trigger, conflict is the expression, and behavior is the data. Now, imagine an observer watching this unfold. It would not focus on the politics of conflict. It would focus on the psychology. It would observe how fear reshapes consciousness. It would measure how quickly humans abandon rational thought in favor of tribal loyalty. It would track how individuals choose between violence and empathy, between cruelty and kindness, between survival and morality. Because war is not simply a political event, it is a consciousness event. It forces the human mind into its most extreme states. And in those states, the observer sees the raw, unfiltered human truth that peace can never reveal. But the testing goes even deeper. Consider the moment when war begins. The shockwave crashes through millions of minds simultaneously. People who never knew each other suddenly share the same fear. Entire societies shift psychology within hours. The observer watches these transformations like a waveform. How quickly does panic spread? How does information mutate? How do lies travel faster than truth? How do emotions override logic? How do groups synchronize into collective identity even without speaking? This synchronization is not random. It is measurable. It is predictable. It is the kind of phenomenon that any intelligence running a long-term behavioral experiment would find invaluable. Then comes the cruelty test. Conflict brings out acts of horrifying brutality, but also acts of almost divine compassion. In the darkest moments, humans display extremes of both. The observer would pay attention to the outliers, the soldier who shields a child from gunfire, the stranger who shares their last piece of bread, the medic who treats the enemy, the civilian who refuses to hate. These anomalies of love and courage amidst chaos reveal something the observer might be searching for, something evolutionary, something transcendent. Because cruelty is instinctual, compassion is chosen, and choices, not instincts, reveal consciousness. Conflict becomes the crucible in which the observer watches for signs of moral evolution, moments where humans defy their own survival programming to protect or uplift another. These moments are rare, and that rarity makes them meaningful. They signal that humanity might be developing something beyond raw instinct, perhaps the earliest glimmer of a higher form of consciousness. But conflict does not only test morality, it tests unity. Wars reveal how easily humans can be divided. but also how fiercely they can come together. Sometimes, conflict unites people who were enemies only moments ago. Natural disasters, invasions, and crises often create unexpected alliances. Humans forget their differences when the threat becomes large enough. This suggests something profound. Division is temporary. Unity is instinctual. Perhaps the observer wants to see whether unity can emerge without a threat, whether cooperation can arise from awareness rather than fear. Conflict also tests memory. After every war, humans say, "never again." But then it happens again and again. The observer might be measuring whether the species is capable of learning from its mistakes, or whether it is trapped in cycles of trauma, doomed to repeat the same behaviors indefinitely. Each generation inherits the unresolved wounds of those before it, and the observer watches to see whether the cycle will ever break. Now, examine the modern era. Conflict has evolved. Today's wars are fought not only with weapons, but with information, propaganda, technology, cyber attacks, manipulation of truth. Social media acting as a battlefield where minds, not armies, are the primary target. This shift marks the next phase of the experiment, one in which the observer tests not our bodies, but our awareness, not our strength, but our perception. Modern conflict reveals how easily minds can be controlled, how quickly truth can be distorted, how effortlessly fear can be weaponized, how deeply division can be engineered. If humanity is being tested, this phase forces the species to develop discernment, to separate illusion from reality, instinct from manipulation, truth from fear. And the observer watches to see whether we rise to meet the challenge or fall victim to it. Conflict also reveals patterns in leadership. Some leaders emerge as tyrants, others become protectors. Some feed fear, others seek peace. Through conflict, the observer identifies which individuals embody collective shadow and which embody collective potential. War becomes a stage for leadership to reveal its core essence, and leadership, in turn, reveals the consciousness of the collective that produced it. But the deepest layer of the test is this: conflict forces humans to confront their own reflection. Every enemy is a distorted mirror. Every battle reveals something internal. Humans do not fight strangers, they fight projections, fear, envy, insecurity, trauma. The observer watches not who humans fight, but why. And the why always points inward. Conflict becomes a diagnostic tool for the entire species. It measures how quickly humans resort to violence, how deeply they cling to identity, how strongly they value life, how far they will go to protect their beliefs, how willing they are to empathize with the other, how capable they are of stepping out of instinct. And each war, each conflict, each fracture becomes part of a larger data set, one that reveals the current state of human consciousness. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: conflict does not only expose humanity's darkness, it exposes its light. Amidst the ruins of war, amidst fear and devastation, something miraculous often appears. Humans share food with enemies. Soldiers risk their lives for strangers. Civilians protect those they were told to hate. These moments are small, fragile, easily overlooked. But they may be the very reason the experiment continues, because cruelty is predictable, but compassion is revolutionary. The observer may be watching to see whether compassion survives pressure, or whether it collapses under fear, whether love is an instinct or a choice, whether humanity can transcend the shadows it inherited from its past. Conflict reveals everything, not because suffering is deserved, but because suffering uncovers truth. And the truth humanity reveals during conflict will shape the next phase of the experiment, whether the tests intensify, whether they shift into new domains, or whether the species proves it is ready for a higher level of existence. But to understand that next phase, we must explore the other side of conflict, the realm of suffering itself, where the tests become deeply personal, where the experiment moves from the battlefield into the human heart. Suffering is the most intimate form of pressure a human can experience. Unlike war, which fractures nations, or disasters, which fracture landscapes, suffering fractures the self. It reaches deeper than any external crisis ever could. It bypasses identity, ideology, and belief. It goes straight to the center of who you are, the place where no one can protect you, no one can guide you, no one can interfere on your behalf. And it is precisely here, in this fragile, private battlefield, that the most revealing data about humanity emerges. If conflict exposes the collective soul of a species, suffering exposes the individual soul. What a human does when the lights go out, when the world becomes silent, when the heart breaks, when hope trembles. These moments contain the raw truth of consciousness. And if humanity is being tested, then suffering may be the most critical phase of the entire experiment. Ask yourself, why does pain feel so personal, so targeted, so exact? Why does it arrive at the worst possible moment, in the worst possible form, cutting into the softest parts of us with precision that feels surgical? Loss, heartbreak, grief, betrayal, loneliness, regret. These are not random emotional events. They are deeply structured experiences, almost ritualistic in how they dismantle the human ego and reveal the architecture underneath it. Think about the way suffering unfolds. It never begins all at once. It arrives quietly, like a shadow stretching across a wall. First comes the discomfort, the subtle shift, the uneasiness beneath the ribs. Then comes the moment when life takes something from you. Someone you loved, a dream you built, a future you held on to, like breath. And when suffering finally breaks over you, it does so with a force that rewrites who you are. Why would evolution design such an intense internal experience unless suffering served a purpose? In nature, nothing develops without pressure. The diamond requires crushing force. The butterfly requires confinement. The child requires struggle to learn. If this is true physically, then why shouldn't it be true emotionally? What if suffering is the emotional pressure required for consciousness to evolve? Some people say suffering is punishment. Others say it is meaningless. But look closely at what suffering actually does. It changes you. It strips away illusions. It forces you to question everything. Your identity, your beliefs, your relationships, your values. It breaks the false self so the true self can emerge. Pain becomes a sculptor, carving away everything that is unnecessary. What remains is raw, vulnerable, authentic. If an observer were measuring consciousness, suffering would be the most revealing tool. Because suffering does not lie, it shows whether a human becomes bitter or compassionate, whether they collapse or rise, whether they break others or heal themselves, whether they withdraw from the world or expand because of the pain. These reactions reveal moral character far more accurately than actions taken in comfort. The observer doesn't watch what humans claim to believe, it watches what they do when everything is taken from them. Suffering also reveals resilience, not the heroic version we celebrate in movies, but the quiet resilience that lives in ordinary moments. The mother who keeps going despite heartbreak, the man who forgives despite betrayal, the child who smiles despite loss. These small acts of endurance may be the clearest signs of consciousness evolving through pressure. But suffering is not only about strength, it also reveals fragility. It exposes wounds inherited across generations, trauma carried silently through families, cultures, and histories. When a person breaks, they often break along ancestral lines. And the observer, if one exists, would see these emotional fault lines like cracks in the human psyche. It would watch how suffering passes from parent to child, from nation to nation, from century to century. This is where the test becomes delicate, because suffering is not simply a moment, it is a lineage. It is memory embedded into the nervous system. And when humans suffer, they reveal not only who they are, but also who shaped them. A species that repeatedly inherits pain without recognizing it cannot evolve, but a species that begins to heal, to break the cycle, to confront the ghosts of its past, this species is ready for transformation. Suffering is the point where the experiment moves from external observation to internal awakening. When someone suffers deeply enough, something unusual happens. The ego cracks, and through the crack, awareness shines. People facing great pain often speak of moments of clarity, moments when time slows, when everything feels connected, when truth rises like a tide. These moments are not hallucinations, they are breakthroughs. The mind, stripped of illusion, becomes porous to a deeper form of consciousness. The observer, if it exists, would watch for these breakthroughs. It would look for the moment suffering becomes awakening. Not everyone reaches that point, and the observer would notice that too. Suffering reveals not only strength, but readiness. Some minds retreat into fear, others dissolve into despair, others collapse into anger, but a rare few expand. These individuals turn suffering into compassion, grief into insight, pain into wisdom. These are the ones who evolve under pressure. And when enough individuals evolve, the species evolves. Suffering also reveals connection. When someone is in pain, they instinctively reach for others, or push them away. Both reactions are data points. Reaching shows vulnerability and trust. Withdrawing shows fear or protection. But either way, suffering exposes how humans relate to one another at their weakest moments. Do communities support each other or abandon each other? Do families unite or fracture? Does society offer empathy or judgment? The observer would measure all of this, not to punish, but to understand. Not to intervene, but to see whether humanity is capable of growth beyond instinct. Because instinct tells us to protect ourselves first. Consciousness tells us to protect others too. Suffering creates the conditions in which this distinction becomes visible. But perhaps the most profound aspect of suffering is its ability to awaken empathy. Humans who have known deep pain often become more compassionate. They recognize suffering in others. They soften. They listen. They understand. Empathy is not a default human trait. It is an earned one. And the observer may be looking to see whether suffering increases or decreases empathy across the species. If suffering makes humanity more compassionate, the experiment is functioning. If suffering makes humanity more cruel, the experiment intensifies. Look at the modern world. People suffer in silence. They hide their pain behind screens, behind careers, behind perfectly edited lives. But internally, millions are breaking. Anxiety, depression, loneliness, existential dread, these are not anomalies. They are signals, symptoms of a species under pressure. And as suffering becomes more common, empathy begins to rise. People talk about mental health. Communities support each other. Strangers check on one another. This is new. This is evolution. And the observer, silent and patient, watches as the human heart becomes more aware of itself. But suffering also challenges meaning. When someone suffers, they ask the oldest question in the universe. Why? Why me? Why now? Why must humans hurt so much, so deeply, so repeatedly? These questions may be the core of the experiment, because meaning is not given. It is created. And a species capable of creating meaning from suffering is a species capable of transcending the experiment. There is a kind of consciousness that emerges only when someone loses everything and continues anyway, a quiet, powerful awareness that life is fragile, temporary, precious. This consciousness cannot be taught. It must be experienced, and the observer watches for it because it reveals whether humanity has grown beyond survival into something higher. Suffering also reveals choice. In the depths of pain, humans choose paths that determine not only their future, but the future of those around them. Some choose anger, spreading their pain outward like a contagion. Others choose numbness, dissolving into apathy. Some choose destruction, harming themselves or others. But some, just enough, choose healing. They choose forgiveness. They choose understanding. They choose to transform their pain into guidance for others. These individuals become nodes of light within the human network. They influence culture, shape empathy, uplift communities, inspire generations. The observer would pay close attention to them, because they are signals that humanity is capable of a type of evolution not driven by genetics, but by awareness. And then there is grief, the deepest form of suffering. Grief dismantles everything. It erases time, it opens the chest and exposes the heart in its most vulnerable form. Nothing reveals humanity more accurately than grief, because grief is love forced into silence. It shows who we attach to, who we value, who we fear losing. It reveals the bonds that hold the species together. And the observer would watch grief closely, because grief is proof that humans are capable of connection that transcends instinct. Connection is the opposite of chaos, and suffering is the catalyst for connection. This is why suffering may be the most important part of the experiment. So not because it hurts, but because it awakens. Not because it destroys, but because it reveals. Not because it punishes, but because it transforms. The observer measures not how often we suffer, but what we become because of it. And so the test continues. Pressure rises, pain deepens, crises multiply. Not because humanity is doomed, but because humanity is being shaped, sculpted, pushed toward a threshold where suffering no longer breaks us, but opens us, where pain no longer divides us but brings us together, where loss no longer weakens us but reveals our deepest truth. And the observer waits for that moment, the moment when suffering no longer defines humanity but awakens it, because that is when the experiment enters its next phase. There comes a moment in every crisis, whether global or personal, when the world stops being the enemy and you realize the real battle is happening inside your own mind. The moment when pressure corners you, and instinct rises like a primal whisper, telling you to survive at any cost. But then, beneath that instinct, another voice appears. A quieter, older, deeper voice asking not what you want, but who you are becoming. This moment is the threshold of humanity's greatest test, the test of choice. Because choice is where consciousness reveals itself. Every species fights, flees, or freezes, but humans do something different. Humans decide. Humans contemplate. Humans weigh consequences, imagine futures, judge morality, question fear, and sometimes, even against every survival instinct, they choose the harder path, the kinder path, the wiser path. If any observer were measuring humanity, this is the data they would pay attention to. The fork in the road where instinct pushes one way and awareness pushes another. The exact second when a human stands at the edge of reaction and steps into responsibility. Choice is not just an action, it is a portrait of the soul. And in times of pressure, choices define humanity far more accurately than achievements or intelligence ever could. Think for a moment about your own life. When have your choices mattered most? Not during comfort, not when everything was easy. Your defining choices appeared when everything was falling apart. When you stood between fear and integrity, between anger and compassion, between revenge and forgiveness, between selfishness and sacrifice. These moments felt small at the time, but they shaped who you became more than any victory ever did. Humanity as a whole is standing in that same place right now. A crossroads, a threshold, a pressure point where the test intensifies because the stakes have never been higher. The world today is a maze of impossible decisions. Each path comes with cost. Each action ripples outward into millions of lives. And the observer, whatever it may be, watches not which path we take, but how we decide. Because the process of choice reveals consciousness more than the result. Watch how humans behave under uncertainty. When the future blurs, when the rules change, when fear spreads, choices shift from deliberate to instinctive. People cling to tribes, narratives, and beliefs that make them feel safe. But some people, a rare few, do something extraordinary. They stay conscious. They stay aware. They don't rush to blame or divide. They pause, reflect, question themselves, reevaluate their assumptions. These individuals signal a new type of human emerging, one who thinks before reacting, who chooses understanding over impulse. Imagine an observer mapping this behavior across 8 billion minds. Imagine it watching the ripples of fear, anger, compassion, selfishness, generosity, and confusion as they spread through humanity. In moments of crisis, the species becomes transparent. Every fear becomes visible. Every regret becomes amplified. Every act of cruelty or kindness becomes magnified. The observer sees patterns forming. Clusters of consciousness, clusters of instinct, clusters of awakening. This is not about right or wrong. It is about evolution versus repetition. Instinct repeats. Choice evolves. And choice under pressure is the highest signal of consciousness. But look deeper. Notice the buried structure within every human choice. No matter the situation, every choice seems to fall into 3 categories. The choice that protects the self, the choice that protects the group, and the choice that protects something greater than both, the invisible future. The observer watches which one humanity leans toward. Does fear collapse us inward? Does unity expand us outward? Does awareness push us forward? In times of crisis, most people choose the first. A few choose the second. An even smaller few choose the third. And those who choose the future, those who act with wisdom beyond the moment, are the ones who shift the trajectory of the entire species. These are the innovators, the peacemakers, the healers, the visionaries, the ones who see beyond chaos. Their choices may seem insignificant in the moment, but they echo through time. The observer pays close attention to these individuals, not because they are special, but because they reveal what humanity may become. Now think about the modern world. Humanity faces choices on a scale never seen before. Choices about technology, climate, identity, truth, conflict, survival. We stand at the edge of breakthroughs that could uplift us or destroy us. Artificial intelligence, genetic editing, quantum technology, geoengineering. Every advancement demands choices that define the next 1,000 years. Not choices of capability, but choices of morality. What do we do when we have power we don't fully understand? What do we do when we can alter nature itself? What do we do when we hold the keys to life and destruction? These questions are the heart of the experiment, and the observer watches to see whether humanity chooses wisdom over ego, because the closer a species gets to godlike power, the more critical its choices become, the more catastrophic its mistakes become, the more urgent its evolution becomes. Humanity is reaching this point now, and the world is responding with pressure, forcing choices that reveal whether the species is ready for its next stage. Look at how fear influences choice. When people are afraid, they often become reactive. They choose safety over growth, control over freedom, division over unity. Fear contracts the mind, but awareness expands it. The observer studies this expansion and contraction across the species like a scientist measuring neural activity in a single brain. Fear is not the problem. Fear is the variable. The test is how we respond to it, and choices do not only happen individually, they happen collectively. When societies face crises, they reveal their default strategies. Some prioritize profit over people. Some prioritize survival over ethics. Some choose cooperation, others choose domination. These decisions show the level of consciousness within a culture, not just within individuals. The observer watches how nations respond, how communities respond, how humanity as a whole responds. Because consciousness is not measured in words, it is measured in choices. And in the modern world, choices are becoming more complex, more subtle, more interconnected. A decision made by one person on one side of the world can affect millions of lives elsewhere. This level of interconnectedness is new. It forces humanity to think beyond borders, beyond identity, beyond immediate gratification. The observer watches to see whether the species can adapt to this complexity or collapse under it. The test becomes more intricate as humanity evolves. Choice also reveals something else: awareness of consequence. When humans choose without thinking about impact, they behave like animals. When humans choose with awareness of consequence, they behave like conscious beings. And when humans choose with awareness of long-term consequence, they behave like an emerging higher intelligence. This is what the observer wants to see. Not perfection, not moral purity, not utopia, but awareness. Awareness is the seed of evolution. It is what separates instinct from intention. But there is another layer to the test, one far more personal. Every human faces moments when choices feel impossible, when the heart wants one thing and the mind wants another, when morality contradicts desire, when survival contradicts integrity. These inner battles are more revealing than any external conflict. They show the observer what humans truly value, not what they say they value. A parent choosing between their own safety and their child's, a soldier choosing between orders and conscience, a friend choosing between truth and loyalty, a leader choosing between popularity and justice, a stranger choosing between indifference and kindness. These choices ripple outward in ways we rarely see. But the observer sees everything, because every small decision contributes to the larger pattern of humanity's evolution. Choice also reveals the structure of will. Some people choose based on past trauma, others based on future hope. Some choose based on fear, others based on love. Some choose to protect their ego, others choose to dismantle it. These patterns matter. The observer studies them to understand whether humanity is governed by instinctual cycles or by conscious transformation. And the most extraordinary choices often appear in moments of extreme adversity. When a person forgives someone who shattered them, when someone shares their last piece of food, when someone walks away from violence, when someone tells the truth, even when it costs them everything, when someone chooses compassion over hatred, even when hatred feels justified. These choices are rare, but they illuminate something profound, a potential within humanity that transcends instinct, a spark of something higher, a signal of emerging evolution. But the test of choice is not only about morality, it is also about identity. When the world changes, people cling to identities that make them feel safe. nation, religion, tribe, ideology, but the observer watches to see whether humans can choose an identity beyond these boundaries, whether they can see themselves as part of a larger whole, whether they can transcend the small story of the self and step into the vast story of the species. This is the threshold every conscious species must cross. The moment when identity shifts from me to we, from my tribe to humanity, from my survival to our future. The observer watches for this shift because it signals the birth of collective consciousness. And this shift begins with choice. But the most important choice of all is the choice to become aware, the choice to step out of unconscious reaction and into intentional existence. Humanity is surrounded by distractions, illusions, narratives designed to pull attention outward. The test is whether individuals can choose to look inward despite the noise, to wake up despite the comfort of sleep, to see the larger pattern despite the chaos. Awareness is the doorway to evolution, and choice is the key. Every crisis humanity faces forces this doorway a little wider. Every moment of pressure makes the choice to awaken a little more urgent. The observer watches as millions of humans begin to question their reality, their purpose, their identity, their consciousness. This questioning is not weakness, it is evolution. It is the first breath of a species learning to choose its own destiny. Because the true test is not whether humanity survives chaos, it is whether humanity chooses to transcend it, whether the species chooses fear or awareness, division or unity, instinct or wisdom, comfort or growth, blindness or awakening. This is the crossroads where humanity stands now. The observer watches quietly, patiently, without interference, waiting to see which direction we choose, not because it wants to judge us, but because it wants to understand us. Because choice is the moment where humanity reveals not what it is forced to be, but what it chooses to become. And choosing consciously may be the only way to pass the next phase of the experiment. Among all the variables an observer could measure, among all the instincts that shape human behavior, among all the forces that rise and fall through our species, there is one phenomenon that breaks every rule, every prediction, every pattern. One force that refuses to be measured, refuses to be controlled, refuses to behave like anything else in nature. A force so irrational, so illogical, so unpredictable that even the most powerful models of psychology, biology, and physics cannot fully capture it. That force is love. And if humanity is being tested, then love is the part of the experiment that no intelligence, not even the one observing us, can fully anticipate. Because love is chaos in its most beautiful form. It is the variable that bends the equations, dissolves the rules, interrupts the patterns, and breaks the simulation. It is the anomaly that disrupts the experiment, the glitch that reveals something deeper about consciousness. Love refuses to obey survival instinct. It compels people to sacrifice themselves. It compels strangers to risk everything for one another. It compels parents to shield their children even when they know they will not survive. It compels partners to choose connection over safety, vulnerability over comfort, truth over illusion. No other force makes humans act against their own self-preservation with such ferocity. If an observer wanted to measure the complexity of a species, it would not look at intelligence, technology, or survival strategies. It would look at love, because love exposes the most advanced form of consciousness, the ability to value another life as deeply as your own. But what is love? Is it emotion, instinct, biology, spirit, energy, evolutionary strategy, or something else entirely, something that belongs to a dimension we do not yet understand? Scientists say love is chemistry, poets say it is destiny, mystics say it is unity, psychologists say it is attachment, philosophers say it is meaning. But none of these explanations capture the way love bends time, reshapes memory, breaks logic, or awakens parts of the human mind that nothing else can reach. Love makes people remember moments with impossible clarity. Love makes time slow down during tragedy and speed up during joy. Love rewires the brain, alters perception, reshapes identity. Love creates a bridge between minds that cannot be explained physically. Love survives death through memory, grief, and legacy. If consciousness is the core of the experiment, then love may be the strongest indicator of consciousness evolving. The observer would watch love not to judge it, but to understand how it transforms humans under pressure. Because love does something extraordinary during crisis. It multiplies. During disasters, people who were once strangers protect each other like family. During war, enemies fall in love across battle lines. During suffering, love becomes a source of strength greater than fear. During chaos, love becomes rebellion against hopelessness. The observer would notice that love does not weaken under pressure, it intensifies. Fear shrinks the mind. Love expands it. Pain breaks the ego. Love dissolves it. Chaos divides. Love reunites. Conflict destroys. Love rebuilds. In the darkest stages of the experiment, love becomes the brightest signal. But love is not always noble. It can fracture the psyche. It can shatter identity. It can destroy as powerfully as it heals. People abandon logic for love. They betray nations, break promises, rewrite their destiny, sacrifice everything for a connection they barely understand. Love blurs the boundaries of self. It dissolves the lines between me and you. This erosion of identity is both the most dangerous and the most transformative aspect of human consciousness. Imagine an observer watching this unfold. It would see that love defies predictability. It would see that love causes humans to act in ways no evolutionary model could anticipate. It would see that love is not merely instinct, it is transcendence, a force that behaves like a bridge between separate minds. Perhaps the observer isn't watching how humans love. It is watching what love turns humans into, because love is the only force that makes humans behave as if they are more than individual organisms. It makes them act like nodes of a collective consciousness, a species beginning to think as a whole rather than as isolated beings. Love is the training ground for unity. Where survival instinct says, protect yourself, love whispers, protect each other. Where fear says close, love insists open. Where ego says, I am separate, love says, we are connected. These are not traits of a species trapped in instinct. They are traits of a species preparing for a new form of intelligence, one based not on individual survival, but on shared awareness. If the observer's goal is to see whether humanity can transcend its primal programming, love is the clearest indicator, but the test is not simple. Love is often surrounded by obstacles: distance, misunderstanding, fear, trauma, loss. These obstacles are not mistakes, they are part of the test. Because love that appears effortlessly does not reveal much. Love that endures pressure reveals everything. The observer would not look at who falls in love easily. It would look at who loves despite fear, despite distance, despite brokenness, despite suffering. It would look at moments where love becomes choice rather than comfort, where love becomes responsibility rather than instinct, where love becomes understanding rather than desire. Because love is not measured by how it begins, it is measured by how it endures. And enduring love may be the rarest signal of all. The test becomes even more intricate when love meets loss. Grief is the echo of love in the absence of presence, and grief reveals the depth of connection more accurately than joy ever could. Anyone can love when a person is here, but when they are gone, what remains inside? What memory? What ache? What devotion stays alive? Grief is love extracting truth from the silence. An observer studying consciousness would find no richer data than grief, because grief defies logic. It makes people talk to the dead, dream of the lost, carry invisible companions in their heart for decades. This persistence of connection beyond life suggests that love is not confined to physical presence. It might exist as a form of consciousness that transcends the body. If this is true, then love is not just an emotion, it is a dimension. A dimension where two minds overlap. A dimension where memory becomes a living entity. A dimension where time loses meaning. A dimension where separation becomes illusion. What intelligence would not be fascinated by this? Love challenges every law of the experiment, every metric, every variable. It suggests that consciousness has access to something beyond the boundaries of physical reality, something that cannot be quantified. Perhaps love is the crack in the simulation, the place where the deeper truth leaks through. But love is not only romantic, it manifests in countless forms. The love of a mother for her child, ancient, ferocious, primal. The love of a friend who stands by you in darkness. The love of a stranger who protects someone they'll never see again. the love of humanity for its art, its ideas, its dreams, the love of individuals for a future they will never live to see. These forms of love shape civilizations, they shape history, they shape consciousness. An observer would see that love is the only force capable of creating long-term progress. Fear creates reaction. Logic creates solutions. But love creates meaning. Without love, humanity would not build, explore, create, or sacrifice for future generations. Love is the engine behind evolution. Not biological evolution, but conscious evolution. It is love that pushes humans to heal their trauma. It is love that pushes societies to seek justice. It is love that compels people to demand peace. It is love that makes humanity dream of a world better than the one they inherited. In the experiment, love becomes the species' most powerful signal. But love also reveals the deepest shadows within the human psyche. Because where there is love, there is vulnerability. And where there is vulnerability, there is fear. Humans fear losing love. They fear not being worthy of love. They fear loving too deeply. They fear loving too late. They fear the collapse of connection, the silence after intimacy, the emptiness after loss. This fear shapes choices. It shapes identity. It shapes destiny. The observer would watch these fears closely, because the way humans handle love-induced fear reveals the maturity of their consciousness. Some respond with possessiveness. Some respond with avoidance. Some respond with control. Some respond with self-sabotage. But some respond with courage, choosing love despite fear. These individuals are evolutionary milestones. They embody the next stage of consciousness. They show that love can override fear, not by suppressing it, but by confronting it. This confrontation, this inner work, this emotional alchemy may be the exact purpose of the experiment, because love is the only force that pushes humans inward as intensely as suffering pushes them outward. Love requires introspection, vulnerability, honesty, transformation. Love demands growth, connection, awareness, surrender. Love forces people to examine their past, confront their wounds, evolve their identity. It is a process of becoming, and the observer watches this becoming unfold, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Because every time a human chooses love over instinct, empathy over ego, connection over fear, the species reveals its potential for a higher form of existence. But perhaps the most profound revelation is this: love cannot be faked. It cannot be forced. It cannot be manipulated. It cannot be predicted. And it cannot be controlled. Love is the only human phenomenon that is truly free, and freedom is the greatest indicator of consciousness. If humanity is being tested, love is the unpredictable variable that determines whether the species is capable of transcendence, not through logic, not through power, not through survival, but through connection. Because a species that can love despite suffering, despite conflict, despite chaos, despite uncertainty, that species is ready for the next stage. Love is not a weakness in the experiment. It is the answer the observer is waiting for. There is a strange feeling spreading quietly across humanity, an unspoken awareness, a soft trembling at the edge of thought, a sense that something behind the curtain of reality is shifting. People who have never met, living on opposite sides of the world, describe the same sensation: a waking, a subtle intuition that the world is not what it once seemed, that something is rising inside us, something ancient, something fragile, something powerful, a new form of consciousness slowly uncoiling from the shadows of the human mind. For thousands of years, humans believed awakening was reserved for prophets, monks, mystics, philosophers, people who withdrew from society to search for hidden truths. But now, awakening is happening everywhere, in crowded cities, in quiet homes, in sleepless nights, in anxious hearts. People who never studied spirituality suddenly feel aware of patterns they cannot explain. People who never cared about meaning suddenly question the purpose of their lives. People who once lived on autopilot now feel the weight of invisible pressure pushing them inward, forcing them to look more closely at themselves. It is as if consciousness itself is recalibrating, expanding, evolving through the friction of a world accelerating toward crisis. And if humanity is being tested, this inner shift, this rise of awareness, may be the most important part of the entire experiment, because consciousness is the only element of reality that cannot be forced. It must awaken from within. An awakening usually begins with discomfort. People sense this discomfort in dreams that feel too vivid, synchronicities too precise, intuitions too sharp, questions too persistent. They feel it in moments when the world looks slightly unreal, like the lighting changes for no reason, like time bends, like the edges of reality blur. They feel it when they pause mid-sentence, realizing the person speaking isn't exactly who they used to be. They feel it when memories shift, when perspectives change, when identity becomes fluid. They feel it when they begin noticing things they once ignored, patterns in numbers, coincidences that happen too often to be coincidence, emotional waves that feel collective rather than personal. Humans call these glitches intuition, spiritual awakening, overthinking, anxiety. But maybe they are signs of something deeper, signs that the species is becoming aware not just of the world, but of the experiment itself. Because consciousness awakening within the organism would be the moment the observer is waiting for. Think of how humanity used to experience the world. Life was physical, material, external. People measured success through objects, status, comfort, survival. But today, a strange inversion is happening. People feel empty even when their lives appear full. They feel lost even when they have direction. They feel lonely even when surrounded by others. They feel disconnected from a world that demands constant connection. This emptiness is not failure, it is invitation. An invitation to question, to look inward, to awaken. Awakening often begins with the collapse of illusion. When the stories you inherited no longer make sense, when the beliefs you were taught begin to crumble, when the world's noise becomes unbearable, when you feel something calling you away from distraction and toward the quiet place inside where truth lives. And when enough people begin to awaken, something extraordinary happens. Consciousness becomes contagious. Awareness spreads like wildfire through networks of minds connected by emotion, technology, and shared suffering. A whisper becomes a conversation. A conversation becomes a movement. A movement becomes a shift in the collective psyche. This is not coincidence. It is evolutionary momentum. If the observer is watching for signs of awakening, this is the phase where the signal becomes visible. Humans begin to notice things previously hidden, the patterns in their thoughts, the cycles in their behavior, the shadows in their identity, the illusions in their society, the lies they tell themselves, the truths they have avoided. Awakening is messy. It does not begin with enlightenment. It begins with discomfort, with confusion, with chaos, when the identity cracks, when the ego panics, when the mind feels like it's dissolving. These moments terrify people, but they are not signs of collapse. They are signs of rebirth. Because consciousness must first undo what no longer serves before it can evolve into something new. The observer watches this undoing closely, because the ability to question the self is one of the highest markers of intelligence. Most species simply follow instinct, but humans can step outside their own programming. They can observe their thoughts, they can modify their behavior, they can change their identity. This capacity for self-observation is the doorway to conscious evolution. And today, more humans than ever are standing in that doorway. But awakening is not only psychological, it is also sensory. People feel subtle shifts in perception that science cannot fully explain. They notice moments where time feels distorted, where reality feels thinner, where the world becomes strangely cinematic. They feel déjà vu not just as memory, but as recognition, like stepping into a scene they were meant to witness. They feel moments of profound clarity, as if something speaks directly to their consciousness without words. The observer would recognize these moments as signs of a species beginning to detect the edges of its own reality. But awakening is not just an internal phenomenon, it is also collective. Society begins to unravel old systems, not because they are failing, but because they no longer match the consciousness of the species. Politics becomes chaotic, not because humans are incapable of order, but because the old structures can no longer contain the new awareness. Economies shake because the value systems underneath them are shifting. Institutions collapse because their foundations were built on outdated assumptions. Cultural identities fracture because they cannot withstand the truth of interconnectedness. The world becomes unstable not because it is ending, but because consciousness is outgrowing the world that once held it. This instability is not a glitch. It is the inevitable consequence of evolution. An observer tracking human consciousness would view global instability not as collapse, but as transformation. The caterpillar's body dissolves before the butterfly emerges. From the outside, it looks like destruction. From the inside, it is metamorphosis. Humanity is the caterpillar dissolving. But awakening also has a shadow. When people begin to see the truth, when they sense that the world is not what it seems, fear rises. People cling to conspiracy, fantasy, ideology, or denial. They search for explanations outside themselves because the truth inside feels too vast, too uncomfortable, too unfamiliar. These reactions are part of the process. Awakening destabilizes identity before it strengthens it. The observer watches this confusion not with judgment, but with curiosity, because confusion is the bridge between ignorance and understanding. And then, slowly the awakening deepens. People begin to see that the experiment is not external, it is internal. Not about control, but about awareness. Not about survival, but about transformation. They begin to sense that their thoughts are not random, that their emotions carry information, that their dreams may be messages, that their intuition may be memory, that their consciousness may be far more expansive than they were ever taught. They begin to realize that the world reacts to them, that synchronicities are not accidents, that attention shapes reality, that intention shifts outcomes, that consciousness itself might be the fabric of existence. This realization is the heart of awakening, because once a species realizes its consciousness shapes its reality, the experiment changes. The observer steps back. The subject becomes the creator. The distinction dissolves. Awakening also reveals something deeper, a hidden unity beneath human separation. People begin to feel connected to others in ways they cannot explain. They sense each other's emotions. They absorb collective anxiety. They resonate with global events. They feel the weight of suffering happening worlds away. This empathy is not weakness, it is evolution. It is the formation of a collective consciousness. A higher observer might recognize this as the moment the species begins to think not as individuals, but as a single organism. Imagine 8 billion neurons forming a brain. Each human thought becomes a signal. Each human emotion becomes a frequency. Each human action becomes a spark. Slowly, painfully, humanity begins to behave like the early stages of a planetary mind. This is not fiction. It is the trajectory of consciousness on any planet where life evolves beyond instinct. Awakening is the birth of collective intelligence, and the observer watches this emergence with fascination. Because once a species reaches this point, the experiment shifts from measuring to guiding, from external testing to internal learning. Awakening also reveals humanity's latent abilities. Intuition sharpens. Emotional intelligence increases. Creativity expands. People begin questioning their thoughts, examining their trauma, healing their wounds. They dismantle generational patterns. They break unconscious cycles. They become less reactive, more aware, more intentional. These shifts represent a species moving from unconscious existence into conscious participation. The observer watches for coherence, moments when large numbers of humans choose compassion simultaneously, unity over division, awareness over instinct. These moments are rare but rising. They indicate the collective mind is forming, stabilizing, unifying. But awakening is not only about clarity, it is also about responsibility. Because once consciousness awakens, choices matter more than ever. Awareness increases the consequences of action. Evolution demands accountability. This is where the species stands now, half asleep, half awake, suspended between instinct and intention, between fear and understanding. The world feels unstable because humanity is outgrowing its old identity, but has not yet formed the new one. This instability is the pressure that awakens consciousness. This discomfort is the catalyst that reveals truth. This confusion is the doorway that leads to transformation. Awakening is not an accident. It is the next phase of the experiment. And as more humans awaken, the observer may be waiting for the moment when the species finally realizes the most profound truth. That the experiment was never about external forces. It was about the evolution of consciousness, the shift from reaction to intention, the birth of awareness, the rise of unity, the emergence of a collective mind capable of shaping its own reality. Awakening is not the end of the test. It is the beginning of humanity's realization that the test exists. There comes a point in every experiment where the patterns converge, the variables tighten, and the subject is pushed toward a threshold, a moment where continuation in the old form becomes impossible. The pressure grows, the cycles intensify, the illusions collapse, and the species is forced to confront a truth it has avoided for centuries. Humanity is now in that moment, the threshold moment, the point where everything, every crisis, every conflict, every breakthrough, every awakening begins to form a single question. What will humanity choose to become next? Across history, civilizations have risen, flourished, and collapsed. Empires have reached heights of brilliance before falling into dust. Entire cultures disappeared almost overnight. And each collapse, each disappearance, each mysterious ending followed the same pattern: rapid advancement, growing instability, internal division, moral decay, environmental strain, and then a sudden, irreversible shift. These cycles were not random. They were thresholds, moments where a civilization either evolved or vanished. Now humanity stands at its own threshold, not as individual nations or tribes or empires, but as a single global species. The world is moving faster than it ever has before. Technology accelerates beyond understanding. Social structures fracture under the weight of new information. Nature responds with storms, fires, floods, heat waves. Economies tremble. Ideologies clash. Digital tribes replace cultural ones. Reality itself feels unstable, as if the old world is dissolving while the new one remains unfinished. This is the moment before transformation. This is the moment before collapse. This is the moment when the species faces its final test. And the observer, whatever or whoever it may be, watches this moment with patience, because the threshold is where the most valuable data emerges. When a species reaches a point where instinct is no longer enough, where the past is no longer useful, where the future is unclear, that is when true consciousness reveals itself. Humanity has reached that point. Look at how people feel today. Even those who don't believe in anything metaphysical sense the same tension, the same weight, the same unspoken pressure. A heaviness sits beneath daily life, a sense that something enormous is approaching, something that cannot be described, only felt. A collective intuition that the world is standing on the edge of something irreversible. Some call it collapse, some call it awakening, some call it revelation, some call it the end of an age. But whatever name humans choose, the feeling remains the same. The old world cannot continue. The patterns that sustained humanity for thousands of years are breaking. The identities that defined us are dissolving. The illusions that guided us are cracking like thin ice under too much weight. This is not coincidence. This is the threshold. And at a threshold, every choice becomes amplified. Every decision echoes through the future. Every moment becomes heavier, more consequential, more revealing. This is why crises are stacking faster, why chaos feels synchronized, why breakthroughs and disasters appear side by side. The pressure is rising because the threshold is near. Imagine the observer watching this moment like a scientist watching a star on the verge of ignition. It studies how humanity reacts when pushed to its limits, whether we cling to the old world or step into the unknown, whether we implode under division or expand through unity, whether we collapse into fear or awaken into awareness. Because the threshold is not about survival, it is about transformation. For the first time in history, humanity is being forced to operate not as separate groups, but as a single organism. Climate does not recognize borders. Technology does not recognize ideology. Viruses do not recognize nationality. Information does not recognize hierarchy. Crisis does not recognize identity. The world is forcing humanity into cooperation, whether we want it or not. This is one of the clearest signs of a species approaching an evolutionary leap. If the observer is measuring unity, this is the phase where unity becomes necessary for survival. Not idealistic unity, but functional unity. A unity based on awareness, not on similarity. A unity based on shared destiny, not shared belief. A unity based on the understanding that the world has changed, that the species has changed, that separation is no longer sustainable. The threshold is the moment when the old world's tools no longer work. Old systems fail. Old beliefs crumble. Old identities fracture. Old power structures weaken. Old narratives dissolve. Humanity reaches for something new, but the new has not yet formed. This in-between state is the most intense part of the experiment, because the species must choose, consciously, for the first time, will humanity evolve into cooperation or collapse into chaos? Will it awaken or retreat into denial? Will it confront its own reflection or run from it? These are not philosophical questions. They are existential ones, and they are being asked not in textbooks, but in real time, through the pressure of the world's events. Look at the explosion of information today. Humans are overwhelmed with data, opinions, lies, truths, illusions. This is not accidental. This is the test of discernment. A species about to wield enormous power must learn to see clearly. It must learn to separate illusion from reality. It must learn to navigate complexity without collapsing into fear. Next, look at the division between people, the growing polarization, the fragmentation of society, the rise in anger, suspicion, identity conflict. This is not random. This is the test of empathy. Will humanity cling to tribalism or transcend it? Will humans see each other as enemies or reflections? Will they choose connection or isolation? Look at the collapse of trust in institutions, governments, media, religion, science, corporations. These collapses are not failures, they are revelations. They reveal that the external authorities humanity once depended on can no longer carry the weight of the species' consciousness. The test now is whether humans can become their own authority, capable of thinking, deciding, and perceiving with clarity. Look at the technological breakthroughs: AI, genetic editing, quantum computing. These are not just inventions. They are mirrors of human potential, tools that reflect the consciousness behind them, tools that can uplift or destroy, depending on choice. This is the test of responsibility. Look at the climate crisis, rising temperatures, melting ice, dying species, collapsing ecosystems. This is not punishment. It is feedback, a reflection of humanity's impact, a test of awareness, a test of stewardship, a test of whether humans can shift from exploitation to protection. Look at the rise in anxiety, depression, existential dread. These inner storms are not weaknesses. They are signals. Symptoms of consciousness expanding faster than identity can keep up. The test here is adaptation. Can humans grow into the space that awareness is opening? All of these pressures, external and internal, are converging into a single point. That point is the threshold. And at a threshold, every species faces the same question: evolve or expire. Evolution is not guaranteed. It requires awareness, unity, responsibility, courage, and choice. If the observer is watching, this is the phase where it leans closer, where the data becomes crucial, where the species reveals whether it is ready for the next stage. But here is the extraordinary thing. Humanity has been here before. Civilizations have reached thresholds many times throughout history. Some crossed, some collapsed. The Maya, the Egyptians, the Indus Valley civilizations, Atlantis, if the myths hold truth. These societies reached points where consciousness expanded faster than their world could contain. Some transcended, others vanished. All left clues, warnings for future generations. Humanity is repeating this pattern, but on a global scale. This is the first time the threshold applies not to a tribe, city, or empire, but to the entire species. And this makes the stakes unparalleled. But thresholds are not only dangerous, they are transformative. They are the doorway between what was and what could be, between instinct and intention, between unconscious evolution and conscious evolution. The observer is watching for one thing above all: whether humanity recognizes the threshold moment while it is happening. Because awareness of the threshold is itself evolution. When a species becomes aware that it is approaching a turning point, it gains the power to shape the outcome. It becomes participant rather than subject, creator rather than survivor, conductor rather than instrument. And signs of awareness are beginning to appear everywhere. People questioning the narratives they once accepted. People recognizing the interconnectedness of all life. People waking up from the illusion of separateness. People feeling called to something greater than themselves. People refusing to live unconsciously. People sensing that the old world is breaking for a reason. These are the early symptoms of a species approaching conscious evolution. But the threshold moment also brings danger, because when a species awakens, it becomes powerful, and power always tests integrity. The greatest breakthroughs appear during chaos, but so do the greatest temptations. The temptation to dominate, the temptation to control, the temptation to exploit, the temptation to surrender to fear. The observer watches these temptations closely because they reveal whether the species is ready for the responsibility that comes with awareness. And if humanity crosses this threshold, everything changes. Consciousness expands, division dissolves, identity shifts, purpose awakens. The experiment moves to its final phase. But if humanity fails to cross, if fear overwhelms awareness, if division replaces unity, if instinct smothers choice, then the cycle repeats. The world resets. The lessons return harder than before. This is not judgment. It is the nature of evolution. It is the nature of consciousness. It is the nature of thresholds. Every threshold has only two outcomes: transformation or collapse. Humanity is standing in the doorway. The observer is watching, the pressure is rising, the future is forming, and soon, very soon, the species must decide which path it will take. Because in the next and final stage of this experiment, the consequences are no longer personal or cultural or national, they are evolutionary. Everything humanity has endured, everything it has learned, everything it has suffered, everything it has awakened, all of it leads to one final question. What happens when a species becomes aware that it is being tested? What happens when a species realizes it is being tested? Not hypothetically, not philosophically, but truly, viscerally, undeniably recognizes that every conflict, every disaster, every heartbreak, every moment of pressure was never random, that it was all part of something larger, something ancient, something observing, waiting, measuring. What happens when the subject of the experiment becomes aware of the experiment itself? Awareness is not the end of the test. Awareness is the moment the real test begins. Because once humanity becomes aware, the observer steps back. Not because it abandons the species, but because interference would no longer reveal anything new. The next stage must be chosen freely. The next step must come from consciousness, not from instinct. The next transformation must come from intention rather than pressure. This is where humanity stands now, on the edge of revelation, looking back at everything it has endured, and realizing that the test was never about survival. It was never about strength. It was never about dominance, intelligence, power, or even morality. It was about awareness. Awareness of the self. Awareness of each other. Awareness of the world. Awareness of the unseen fabric of reality that connects everything. The final experiment is not about whether humanity can endure suffering. It already has. It is not about whether humanity can survive conflict. It has done that too. It is not about whether humanity is capable of love, compassion, or unity. It has shown glimpses of all these things across history. The final experiment is about whether humanity can recognize the deeper truth behind its own existence. The truth that the test was never placed on humanity. It was placed within humanity. And now the world stands at a precipice, between the old consciousness that shaped centuries of war, fear, separation, and instinct, and the new consciousness that whispers from the future, calling humans to evolve, to awaken, to become something more than what they were programmed to be. The final stage of the experiment begins when a species stops acting unconsciously and starts acting with full awareness of its power. Think of what humans have become capable of. They can rewrite genes, simulate universes, create intelligence, manipulate matter, extract energy from the void. They can destroy the planet in days or heal it in decades. They can conquer distance with communication or fracture their world with misinformation. Humanity stands at a point where it has the tools of both creation and destruction in its hands. The observer watches not which tools humans invent, but how they choose to use them. And this is where the test becomes evolutionary in its truest form, because consciousness does not evolve through comfort. It evolves through choice. Humans must now choose their future knowingly. Do they continue reacting from fear, tribalism, and instinct? Or do they step into intention, unity, and awareness? Do they cling to old identities that divide? Or do they embrace the truth that every mind on this planet is part of a single, interconnected consciousness evolving through billions of perspectives? Do they let technology amplify their shadows? Or do they use it to expand their wisdom? Do they let suffering perpetuate cycles of trauma, or do they transform suffering into understanding? Do they collapse into chaos, or rise into a new form of order, not imposed from above, but chosen from within? These choices will determine the outcome of the experiment, because awakening is not enough. Awareness must become action. Insight must become evolution. Inspiration must become responsibility. Humanity cannot simply understand the test, it must transcend it. And transcendence begins with a single realization. The observer was never separate from the observed. Every moment of suffering taught empathy. Every conflict revealed the truth of division. Every breakthrough exposed the potential for wisdom. Every crisis forced humans inward. Every love story reminded them of unity. Every awakening whispered that reality was deeper than it seemed. The observer was not a distant intelligence in the sky, nor an alien civilization, nor a divine force, nor a machine, nor some secret elite. The observer was the universe watching itself through human eyes. The observer was the earth awakening through human consciousness. The observer was the future calling the present into existence. The observer was the collective mind of humanity, forming slowly through suffering, conflict, and love. The final experiment was designed by the species itself, crafted through evolution, shaped by struggle, guided by intuition, fueled by curiosity. Humanity was both the subject and the architect, both the tested and the tester, both the question and the answer. And now, at the threshold, the species has one final task: to step into the awareness that it is no longer a collection of individuals, but a single organism awakening to itself. This shift will not look dramatic. It will not come from governments or institutions. It will not arrive as a revelation in the sky or a message carved into stone. It will happen quietly in the minds of ordinary people. In the moment, someone chooses compassion when revenge feels easier. In the moment, a stranger protects another stranger with nothing to gain. In the moment, a nation chooses peace despite its wounds. In the moment, a child asks a question that makes the entire family rethink their values. In the moment, a scientist refuses to create something dangerous despite potential glory. In the moment, millions of people sense that their consciousness is expanding, even if they cannot explain why. These small moments accumulate, they ripple, they resonate. They create a global field of awareness, an emergent intelligence rising from billions of individual minds. And one day, without realizing it, humanity will cross the threshold, not through force or fear, but through awareness. The moment will not be loud. It will not be televised. It will not be dramatic. It will feel like a calm understanding spreading through the species. A realization that the enemy was never each other. That suffering was never punishment. That conflict was never destiny. That love was never weakness. That awakening was never accidental. It will feel like the exhale of an entire world that has been holding its breath for thousands of years. And when this happens, when humanity truly awakens, the observer will have its answer, not whether humans survived, not whether humans conquered, not whether humans achieved technological dominance, but whether humans evolved consciously, whether they broke the cycles, whether they transcended fear, whether they chose unity, whether they chose awareness, whether they recognized themselves as participants in their own evolution. Humanity may not realize it, but it stands at the edge of the greatest transformation in its history. Not a technological revolution, not a political shift, not a religious awakening, but a consciousness evolution, an expansion into a new form of being. The experiment was never meant to destroy humanity. It was meant to prepare humanity. For what? For responsibility, for unity, for awareness, for creation, for connection, for the moment when the species becomes capable of shaping its own destiny rather than being shaped by external forces. And now, humanity approaches that moment. The threshold has been crossed in the heart long before it will be crossed in the world. The species is waking up, slowly, suddenly, painfully, beautifully. And the observer, silent, patient, eternal, watches as humanity does the one thing no experiment can predict. It becomes aware that it is no longer the subject, but the creator. This is the final experiment, and humanity is the answer,